Welcome to Clinical Conversations, a Journal Watch podcast. It's for the week ending April 16th, and this is podcast number 83. I'm Joe Elia. For links to earlier podcasts, go to podcasts.jwatch.org. For a detailed look at what's new in clinical medicine, just aim your browser at jwatch.org. This week's offering is an introduction to CardioExchange, which is a joint project between Journal Watch and the New England Journal of Medicine. But more about that later. Right now, here's a summary of the week's top clinical news. There will be changes made to your hospital's visitation policies, perhaps, under new rules requested by President Obama. He's asking Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius to publish rules that would widen visitation rights to include domestic partners and friends. The Washington Post calls the request the most significant step the administration has taken to expand rights of gay Americans. The rules would also affect widows and widowers, some of whom have been unable to receive visits from friends and companion as they were approaching death. And speaking of the federal government, there's apparently plenty of work to be done on the U.S. health system, whose quality is described as suboptimal in the annual report of the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Most disturbing, infections associated with healthcare procedures have either increased or not shown downward movement. We should all be washing our hands more frequently. Next, there's been conflicting advice on the matter of flu vaccine's effects on warfarin and other vitamin K antagonists, but a study from Archives of Internal Medicine has apparently solved the issue. It concludes, after a randomized crossover controlled study of 100 patients on stable warfarin therapy, that flu vaccines don't affect these regimens, and that there's no need for increased INR testing after the shots. Finally, the American Academy of Neurology has updated its guidelines on identifying drivers at high risk of driving with dementia. Chief among these is a caregiver rating the patient's driving as marginal. That's the news for this week. Now, on to the interview. As an introduction to CardioExchange, we bring you an interview recorded earlier this week by two of CardioExchange's clinician editors, Richard Lange and L. David Hillis. They interviewed two cardiologists, Gregg Stone and William Boden, respectively of Columbia University and the University of Buffalo. The point of the conversation was to discuss the implications of the COURAGE study and its sub-studies, published first in the New England Journal of Medicine. The study, as you may recall, compared medical therapy alone with medical therapy combined with PCI in the initial management of patients with stable coronary artery disease. The study found that PCI reduced angina, but it didn't reduce the hard endpoints of death, myocardial infarction, and later hospitalizations for coronary disease. Before that conversation, just a word about CardioExchange. It's an experimental site combining blogs, content from Journal Watch and the New England Journal of Medicine, and it's trying to create an online community for clinicians focused on prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of cardiovascular diseases. Now, you can request a membership in CardioExchange by going to www and then the single word CardioExchange.org and clicking on Request Membership. You'll be asked to fill out a profile, and assuming you are a medical professional in a field related to cardiology, you'll be approved within 24 hours. Okay, here's the interview, and I'll give you a reminder at the end of it on how to join CardioExchange.
This is Rick Lange and David Hillis with CardioExchange, and we have with us today Bill Boden and Gregg Stone. And there are several questions that we'd like to address for each of you to answer. And let me throw the first question out. And Gregg, I'll let you start off with answering this one. Given all the debate and controversy surrounding the COURAGE trial of optimal medical therapy versus revascularization in patients with stable coronary artery disease, I am interested, as I'm sure our listeners are what are the issues on which you and Bill find agreement?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. This is Gregg Stone. I think that Bill and I probably agree with a lot of the central issues now, much more than we actually did 2 years ago. And I think that's a natural evolution, frankly, of what happens when a study as complex as COURAGE is initially presented, and all one has to look at is the broad brushstrokes of such a accomplishment versus the data that is then rolled out over the next several years, which allow you to understand the study more in depth. And that's exactly what has happened here. I think when the initial overview study came out, just quote the results of optimal medical therapy versus optimal medical therapy plus angioplasty with primarily bare metal stents in patients with stable ischemic heart disease performed at certain centers. We had a limited way to look at and to try to understand what in some ways were expected results, but in other ways were confusing results. Now what we've learned from this study is that there are two patient groups that I believe, and I believe Bill will agree with this, although we may disagree on the matter of defining those groups, but there are two groups that tend to benefit from the interventional strategy up front. And those would be patients who have significant symptoms in whom the quality of life tends to be better immediately and for a longer duration with an interventional approach compared to medical therapy, and then those with a significant amount of ischemia. And while COURAGE was not large enough, and the COURAGE nuclear substudy was not large enough to definitively prove that death and myocardial infarction is reduced in patients with a large amount of ischemia that are revascularized, I think that when one looks at the data from the COURAGE nuclear substudy, in addition to studies that have previously come out of the Cedars-Sinai database, and actually was just reported at the American College of Cardiology meeting from the Duke database, it suggests that this is a very reasonable hypothesis.
Bill, let me throw the same question out to you. Would you agree on these issues that Gregg's mentioned?
Yes, this is Bill Boden, and again, I also welcome the opportunity of having this dialogue with Gregg and our listeners. I think, as Gregg correctly points out, I think with any complex trial, it does require a good deal of thought and reflection to really put the trial into some clinical therapeutic perspective. I think that there was a good deal of controversy, I think, initially surrounding the trial and the interpretation of the trial and some of the limitations of the trial. And maybe we can circle back to those issues because I think those still do pose some of the uncertainties or what are the issues that have not been totally resolved by COURAGE. But I think one of the things that really comes across that I think we would agree on is that optimal medical therapy forms the cornerstone or the foundation upon which all other therapy is layered. I think we would all agree that regardless of whether a decision is made to proceed to PCI, bypass surgery, or to just continue medical therapy, that intensive, robust medical therapy is a critical determinant of how patients will do and how they should be treated. And that I think COURAGE also tells us that if you aggressively seek to treat patients to multiple targets for blood pressure, lipids, hemoglobin A1C, and other indices, that one can achieve very good clinical outcomes with disease-modifying therapy that is now available to us. So I think, I'm sure Gregg would agree that in today's world, one cannot simply optimally treat a patient by performing, only a catheter-based procedure or some type of surgical revascularization, that we need to combine optimal medical therapy with PCI or surgery in those instances, as Gregg alluded to, where patients either have disabling symptoms, impaired quality of life, significant ischemia, and so forth as indications for treatment. I think those are the main things that have come into focus since the COURAGE trial has been published. And again, I think as we have further dissected the trial results, I think it's clear that the patients who were more symptomatic at baseline, these were the patients in the quality of life paper, for example, who were in the lowest tertile of Seattle Angina Questionnaire score. That is to say, they had the most frequency and severity of angina and the most impaired quality of life. those were the patients who derived the most clinical benefit from revascularization. In addition, the patients who had severe myocardial ischemia at baseline, based on the COURAGE sub-study, were the ones who had better resolution of their myocardial ischemia with the performance of PCI as compared with optimal medical therapy. What we weren't able to demonstrate in COURAGE was the link between ischemia reduction and event reduction. As Greg mentioned, the study simply was too small and underpowered to really examine that critically, and I think this forms the basis of a subsequent large trial planning initiative that is currently under peer review at the NIH.
Well, Bill, if I can jump in, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the COURAGE nuclear sub-study did establish the link between ischemia reduction and event reduction. Those patients who had the largest reductions in ischemia and the lowest amount of residual ischemia had the lowest subsequent event rates. What it did not establish was whether a therapy which was applied to reduce ischemia in a randomized fashion would then lead to lower event rates, given the potential complications of the therapy, et cetera.
Right. So yes, the ischemia reduction in the 20% of patients who fell into that category was associated with better outcomes. But again, you have to recognize that was a pretty small subset of patients, I think 68 patients in that sub-study. So again, one has to be concerned about the validity of a small sub-study such as this, and p-values that are of borderline significance, in the 0.045 or 0.05 range or 0.07 range. So again, a signal of benefit. And again, remember also that by design, COURAGE was not designed to achieve complete myocardial revascularization. I mean, the intent by study design was to compare these two initial strategies of management, and the goal was not to fix every stenosis that was visualized by the operator. And so one of the unresolved issues, I think, that remains to be clarified in the aftermath of COURAGE is what if a trial or a strategy could be undertaken where by design there was a goal of achieving more complete revascularization with more contemporary catheter-based approaches as we now have available to us.
So, Bill and Greg, both of you have mentioned unresolved issues and uncertainties that result from the COURAGE trial. So let me frame it in a different way. That is, how should we design the next study to resolve some of these uncertainties and some of these unresolved issues?
Okay, this is Gregg Stone. I think prior to directly getting into what that next definitive trial might look like, I think there were several important aspects of the way COURAGE was run that we might discuss that would inform that next study, and I'd also love to get Bill's impression on these. Number one is the issue of angiography as an, if you will, sentinel event to enroll patients in the COURAGE trial. Patients were enrolled only after having the anatomic criteria met as documented by angiography, and what that does, of course, is allows you to enroll patients who have coronary artery disease, but it also leads to the potential exclusion of a lot of patients in whom the operators feel, quote, have to, end quote, have intervention because they've got either perfect coronary anatomy, they would be very low risk for intervention, they've got a very large amount of myocardium at risk. In other words, there are preconceived biases that go into that. And in fact, what we've seen is that after the results of COURAGE in clinical practice, a lot of people took the COURAGE results to mean you did not need screening angiography in patients that otherwise had overt stable ischemic heart disease, and we saw several untoward results from that type of strategy. So I think that's important to address. That COURAGE required upfront angiography, but that leads to a potential bias in enrollment, and it also leads to a potential high rate of crossovers once you know the coronary anatomy. So that'd be issue number one. Issue number two, Courage primarily used bare metal stents as a revascularization modality and didn't use a lot of what we would consider optimal adjunct pharmacotherapy in the invasive arm. And if you are designing a trial to primarily reduce ischemia, we do know that drug-eluting stents are significantly better than bare metal stents at reducing ischemia. Now, while they haven't necessarily been shown to reduce myocardial infarction or death, that's in kind of an all-comers population, and there's never been a randomized trial with drug-eluting stents yet, just looking at a population to reduce ischemia. And then the third topic, and then I'll stop speaking, is this issue of optimal medical therapy. And I do completely agree with Bill that the cornerstone of treatment for all patients is optimal medical therapy, although I am concerned that we do somewhat create an artificial situation in these randomized trials because we often give the patients the medications for free because they're supplied by the pharmaceutical manufacturers for the study at our request. We often provide frequent office visits, screening visits by study personnel at a higher incidence or at least with easier access than would occur in the real world. And the compliance with medical therapy and the goals that were achieved with Courage were just unseen before in any other study. And while I certainly do feel they represent a beacon that we should all be aiming for, they're much greater than we've seen achieved yet in any real-world situation. So on one hand, it is looking at truly optimal medical therapy in the control arm, but I don't know if it's looking at real-world medical therapy.
So, Bill, let's design the next study. Let's put you and Gregg in a room, and this is Rick Lange asking this. Let's put you and Gregg in a room, and let's come out with the optimal study. What's it look like?
Well, Rick, this is Bill Boden once again. We have largely, I think, accomplished that goal. That is to say, there's been a very deliberate undertaking of a large international trial proposal that both Gregg and I, along with Judy Hockman from NYU, who's the study chair, David Marin, who is one of my colleagues from Vanderbilt, who is participating in the Courage trial, he sort of emerged as the PI for this new trial, Gregg, David Williams from the Brigham, and Bob Harrington from Duke, have all come together along with great multitude of other key opinion leaders and experts in the field of ischemic heart disease to, in fact, configure what we hope will be the logical trial that would be a worthy sequel to Courage. And it will really seek to address, in large measure, the three areas that Gregg has just listed, which is to say a randomized trial that will enroll patients on the basis of having moderate to severe ischemia as the entry requirement for randomization, so that we will not include people with ischemic heart disease who have only mild ischemia, where there would be less likelihood to demonstrate the benefit from revascularization, whether it's with PCI or bypass surgery, but rather include only patients with moderate to severe ischemia, where we have both observational data from Cedars-Sinai, among other sites, as well as the Courage nuclear sub-studies to indicate that this may be a target subset of patients who may, in fact, derive significant clinical event reduction with more complete revascularization. And if randomization occurs proximal to the cath lab before the anatomy is defined, then essentially we eliminate the whole issue of selection bias, which so confounds any strategy trial where you are biased by knowing the anatomy, and hence that can color your decision as to whether or not the patient's included, or if the patient is enrolled and then has subsequent angina, it may actually facilitate your decision to cross the patient over because you know the anatomy. As Gregg alluded to as well, the use of drug-eluting stents, which we didn't use in Courage because we really couldn't access them during the conduct of the trial, I think would go a long way toward ensuring that we would be able to achieve greater revascularization, that is to say, better target revascularization with lower rates of restenosis and fewer complications, as we achieved in Courage, where the procedural success rate was 89% and at least viewed as lower than what can be achieved in more contemporary practice. We can debate whether there is sufficient data to inform us about whether drug-eluting stents will ultimately reduce death or MI, since at least the randomized head-to-head trials have failed to do this. But clearly, I think the use of drug-eluting stents, and with a strategy designed to achieve complete revascularization of all proximal stenoses that are subtending these moderate to severe ischemic segments, would, I think, ensure that we would do the best job of ensuring that patients might in fact derive benefit. One of the other limitations in COURAGE, which I would hope we would address with this new trial, is that we really didn't get very many patients enrolled in COURAGE with LV dysfunction. Only 18% of the patients in COURAGE had ejection fractions below 40%. And so we have insufficient information from that trial to inform us as to whether patients with more impaired left ventricular function would derive benefit from PCI. As we know, there have been certainly studies with bypass surgery in such patients to indicate that revascularization in that subset of patients is associated with improved clinical outcomes. And then lastly, optimal medical therapy, as Gregg mentioned, I think has evolved dramatically over the last decade, and I think is something that is really lost on a lot of individuals. Everybody accepts the fact that there have been profound evolutions in technology which have resulted in increasingly better procedural-based outcomes, but by the same token, we have an abundance of data from multiple published randomized placebo-controlled studies with disease-modifying therapies that include statins, inhibitors of the renin-angiotensin system, thienopyridines, and other agents which clearly have an impact on improving outcomes. And I think if optimal medical therapy is applied in COURAGE, can be, in fact, generalized and facilitated in a way that is perhaps better utilized, I think that we can, in fact, design the optimal trial where the treatment that we used in COURAGE, along with lifestyle interventions and targeting a population of high-risk ischemia, hopefully with a more representative spectrum of left ventricular dysfunction, who in fact can be shown to benefit from myocardial revascularization to improve death, MI, and hospitalization for either heart failure or acute coronary syndromes.
So this is Gregg. So if I could summarize that excellent answer, what we've really learned from COURAGE is that patients with stable ischemic heart disease who have minimal symptoms and small amounts or absent ischemia certainly don't need revascularization and can and should be managed medically. The real question right now is whether patients with moderate or significant ischemia would, when stable ischemic heart disease, would benefit with a reduction in the heart events of death, myocardial infarction, and repeat hospitalization for severe recurrent acute cardiac events by revascularization. And so we have designed a trial which is being called ischemia, which will be approximately 8,000 to 10,000 patients. This is a global international randomized trial in which patients with stable ischemic heart disease and a moderate to significant amount of ischemia, as evidenced by one of multiple different functional testing methodologies, would be randomized to optimal medical therapy versus optimal medical therapy, followed by angiography with subsequent revascularization as appropriate based on the coronary anatomy with either coronary intervention or bypass surgery. So this is different than COURAGE in multiple respects. There has to be moderate to significant ischemia. The enrollment is before angiography, and the control arm does not undergo routine angiography, and the revascularization modalities allowed are with either PCI or CABG. And again, optimal medical therapy will be applied in both groups, as well as optimal bypass surgery and PCI with the latest generation drug-eluting stents and adjunct pharmacotherapy.
This is Bill again. In many respects, you could say that the ischemia trial design is quite similar to the 8 randomized trials of acute coronary syndromes in NSTEMI unstable angina. All of those trials essentially tested an invasive versus a conservative or a non-invasive, selective invasive approach. And really this is the fundamental design difference with the ischemia trial, to really test two different management strategies of really essentially optimal medical therapy alone versus optimal medical therapy combined with revascularization of choice, with the goal of, again, achieving complete revascularization of all significant stenoses subtending moderate to severe ischemic segments.
So optimal medical therapy plus optimal revascularization.
This is Rick again. David and I have one more question to pose to both of you. You've both alluded to the fact that medical therapy has improved and revascularization techniques, particularly stents, have improved as well. I guess what the question we'd like to pose to you all is, will this actually resolve the issue, or is this something that we're going to need to readdress on a regular basis?
Well, this is Greg. Every randomized trial, especially a strategy trial, as complex and expensive as they are to perform, is really a snapshot in time, which is just testing the devices, drugs, and strategies that are available at that point. Although in this regard, I'm optimistic that these results will apply to the foreseeable future, because as great as the optimal medical therapy was in COURAGE, and again, it was unheralded in its success, the COURAGE nuclear substudy actually did not show a significant reduction in ischemia with that medical therapy. In the patients who received medical therapy in the COURAGE nuclear substudy, there was an average of 8.6% ischemic left ventricular territory at baseline, and at 6 to 18 months, that was 8.1%, which was not a significant difference. Whereas in the patients who were in the bare metal stent group, it was 8.2% at baseline, and it was reduced to 5.5% at 6 to 18 months, which was markedly significant. And we expect drug-eluting stents to do even better. And again, just at the most recent ACC, the Duke database, looking at both PCI and CABG, also found a marked reduction in SPECT evidence of ischemia in several thousand patients with revascularization compared to medical therapy. So I am hoping that while medical therapy will continue to improve, and certainly PCI and surgery will as well, that these results, if we are allowed to do this trial, because this is a grant through the NIH, which is pending at this point, will be very relevant for the foreseeable future.
Bill, this is Rick. Your thoughts? Will this put the issue to rest?
Rick, yeah, so this is Bill, and again, I think as Greg alludes, the whole approach to managing patients with ischemic heart disease, whether we're talking about acute coronary syndromes or stable ischemic heart disease, represents a rapidly moving target. Any trial by design, when it's designed and conducted, always has to be interpreted in the context of therapies as they evolve and are ultimately assumed or assimilated into clinical practice. So all we can do is to try to design this next trial as carefully and as deliberately as we possibly can to hopefully incorporate the best available treatments, both in terms of revascularization approaches as well as therapeutic approaches pharmacologically, to really achieve the best outcomes that we seek for our patients. In particular, I think some of the issues that hopefully will become clarified with this new study will be in diabetics. We have data from the Berry 2D study that came out this past summer, which didn't indicate that there was any significant difference in clinical outcomes among diabetics with stable coronary disease who received revascularization versus optimal medical therapy. Again, there were limitations of Berry 2D that also, I think, preclude our ability to really interpret that trial optimally in the context of contemporary treatment of type 2 diabetics. Other populations of patients that I think are also worthy of study in this particular trial will be women, the elderly, and patients with silent myocardial ischemia. I'm hopeful that we'll be able, in a study that's sized the way this ischemia study is intended to be, with some 8,000 to 10,000 patients, that will be broadly inclusive of the totality of patients based on both sex, in terms of their clinical comorbidities, that is to say their diabetes, their age, their degree of left ventricular function, and so forth, so that when all is said and done in the next 7 or 8 years, we'll have a trial that can be as informative as it possibly can be, in the context of what is viewed to be really optimal treatment, both catheter-based and pharmacologic.
Well, on behalf of Cardio Exchange, David Hillis and I would like to thank both of you for your insights. It's been very enlightening, and we really appreciate your time. Bill and Greg, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Our
Great.
pleasure.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys.
Here's that reminder I promised earlier. You can join Cardio Exchange by going to www.cardioexchange, all one word, .org. Well, that's it for this week. You can reach Clinical Conversations at 1-617-440-4374. Our earlier podcasts are available at podcasts.jwatch.org, where links for all our news stories can also be found. Clinical Conversations executive producer is Adore Yano, and I'm Joe Elia. Join us next time, and thanks for listening.